when I ruled the world.
Want to be under their own face? I'm live. Okay.
Oh yeah, yeah. That's beautiful. Yeah, yeah.
Good morning, all. Good morning. Day two. This is on. Yes, it is. So we've got a fabulous panel here today talking about the trends in biotech. Oh my goodness, there are plenty of new things happening in investing in biotech and lots of things for them to talk about. I'm going to hand very quickly over to Eric Demisi, who is from the New York Stock Exchange, so really does see what's happening at the sharp end of all these deals that are going on. I'm going to hand straight over and let you guys take the stage. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, Morag. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks, everyone, for coming out to hear our story about a very low-stress, easy-to-understand, and fully transparent topic of raising money for your ideas. So we'll dig into that today. I'm Eric Demisi, Director of Healthcare and Life Sciences Capital Markets for the New York Stock Exchange. A little background in my capacity there. I work with private companies that are thinking about the public markets. That could mean an IPO a few months from now. It could be an IPO a few years from now. So I think one message I'd like to make to founders in the audience is when you're thinking about stock exchanges and public markets, and that feels like a really long ways away, we can actually be a really good partner to you along that journey, and I'm happy to talk to anyone about that sort of one-on-one in a little bit. But we have a ton of material to cover today. I thought I'd just throw out a few stats to give you a sense of what the year is looking like so far versus what has been a sort of challenging, interesting, rocky roller coaster of a ride post-COVID. So looking at sort of the IPO issuance this year so far, about 30% of IPOs this year, if you just count up the number of deals that went out, fall within the healthcare sector. So that's decently robust. Most of those are in biotech. So far this year, biotech IPOs have raised around $3.7 billion. All in last year, they raised about $1.6 billion in IPO proceeds. So year over year, we're looking at a really, really big difference. I would say the IPO window has been pretty open for biotech, and it hasn't necessarily been feeling a lot of the macro pressures that some other sectors are feeling. I think that has to do a little bit with sort of the pent-up demand in the pipeline, especially coming out of last year. I thought that'd be interesting. A few fun stats. Kylera, one of the IPOs that came out this year, record-breaking in terms of proceeds raised, $625 million, bigger than Moderna. It's at a new bar. And then I have to shout out, because I'm sitting in New Haven's own Veradermics, which I listed earlier this year, up about 450 to 500% over issue, depending on when you look at the stock. Incredibly strong performance in the post-market so far. We're going to dig into a couple little reasons about why that might be. But obviously, very, very happy to be in the home of that company, the hometown of that company. But I want to jump right into it. We have an amazing panel here. I think what's great about our panelists today, diversity of perspectives and opinions, and I've asked them to really sort of dig deep and think through their own unique perspectives as we cover the topics we're going to cover today. So I do want to start with quick introductions, everyone. I'm going to just start with Christian and go right down the line. Name, firm, what your focus area is for the investors on the panel, fund size and typical check size, and then for those of you on the BD side of the universe, deals you work on, sectors you're focused on, really quickly, and then we'll jump into the rest of the content. So,
thank you, Eric, and thanks everyone for coming, for the Yale organizers for inviting us. So I'm Christian Schubert. I lead the investment team at AbbVie, top 5 pharma company. Some of you may know, primarily focused on immunology, oncology, neuroscience, and more recently also aesthetics, obesity, and respiratory disease. Our fund focuses primarily on pre-seed through Series B stages, so we're really early stage focused. We deploy up to 100 million roughly of AbbVie's balance sheet money annually into 6 to 8 new investments and roughly the same amount of follow-on investments around the growing portfolio. About a third of that capital goes into really early company creations. We do a particular type of company creation that we think has a strategic fit for AbbVie as a potential partnership opportunity in the future, where we think our institutional friends are underinvesting. We write checks as little as $250,000 for that one pre-seed experiment. You just need to convince yourself that the Nature Cell Science paper was real, all the way up to $30 million. And we typically stick with our companies, to the tune of 10 to 25 million over their lifetime until they either get acquired, go public, or wind down.
All right. Good.
Thanks, everyone. My name is Jacques Gayet. I'm with AstraZeneca. I'm in their research and evaluation group focused on cardiovascular, renal, and metabolism that reports up through biopharma. We have 4 business units, one that focuses on oncology, another one that focuses on rare disease, another one that's in infectious disease. I used to be in a BD role that kind of spanned that whole spectrum, and so that in a deal finance role that produced valuation models. So I have a kind of a good understanding of our entire ecosystem. Right now I focus primarily in cardiovascular, renal, and metabolism. I'm a scientist by training, and cardiovascular is kind of my bread and butter. We look for very early stage things up through billion-dollar acquisitions. In cardiovascular, renal, and metabolism, we look for research collaborations that are sometimes on the order of $2 to $5 million investments to kind of bring ideas that have enough preclinical data to IND enabling. In which case, then we might do a license on that on top as a follow-on, all the way up through billion-dollar acquisitions. Notably, my last one in the deal finance group was our Gray Cell acquisition in China.
Mitra Miri, I'm a partner at OUP, Osage University Partners. We're a diversified fund, and I sit on the life sciences side of the house and focus on therapeutics investments. We are stage agnostic, so for example, we participated in Veridermix's IPO, but we also wrote a check into the seed round of D2B3, a Yale spinout. We look to put up to $20 million in a company over the life of the investment.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tim Shannon. I'm a physician by training, used to be on the faculty here, but then spent 20 years in companies, and now have spent almost 18 years at a venture firm in Connecticut called Canaan Partners. So we too are diversified funds. We have a tech and a healthcare side. The healthcare side is nowadays specifically biopharma and therapeutics oriented. Our biopharma allocation for various funds ranges anywhere from 300 to 500 million. From that main, we're seed and Series A is our point of entry, so that's 80 to 85% of what we do. The other, 15% or so will be opportunistic, depending on what's going on in the market. We did our first PIPE ever a year ago in Sadar, which was a 1-for-1, but I wouldn't count on that routinely. We put in from the main fund about $25 million. We try to stuff that into the seed and Series A part, and then we have co-investors from our LP base who come in and help us in the Series Bs and Cs. But we don't typically publicly invest. We'll do what we need to do in a mezz round or need what we need to do in an IPO. But again, we really try to stuff our cash in early. Therapeutic area agnostic. I would say one thing we are, especially as early stage investors, we're definitely more capital sensitive in a world that's become less capital sensitive, which sometimes creates a little bit of stress.
All right. Well, thank you all. So let's dive right in. I want to get a heat check from each of you on sort of the current state of the markets as you see them, again, told from your own unique perspective. I think that's important for everyone. So I want to kind of start at the top of the funnel and then kind of work our way down to the founder level in this room in terms of how capital flows. So Jacques, I'm going to come to you first. So you sit, as you mentioned, in AstraZeneca's BD&L group, cardiovascular, renal, metabolism. We were speaking before the event, and you mentioned, and this has been a big topic of discussion throughout the year, the M&A levels are kind of looking like pre-COVID levels, right? If you look at the numbers, that's kind of playing out. So from your seat, how are you viewing this evolution of M&A, sort of the biotech pharma collaborations from pre, during, and post-COVID, and how are you looking at it kind of right now going forward? So give us that story arc as you've lived it.
Yeah, sure thing. And it's so prior to my role at AstraZeneca, I was also a equity research analyst at Cowen and Company covering big pharma. So I have a good sense of the pharma market in general as well. So I will say pre-COVID, 2016 to 2019, right? I would say a lot of this story focuses on kind of money that's being brought in by big products like Keytruda, right? Or loss of exclusivity, like with Humira, right? And so you're either looking to kind of fill gaps, or you have a big cash position like Merck, and you're trying to buy things or build on for successful programs. And so pre-pandemic, I think in that year span, there was probably about $200 to $300 billion worth of M&A per year that was done in that time frame as an annual average. And a lot of times, you had, of course, IO, you had a lot of immunology, you had big investment in rare disease and gene therapy. And so a lot of that was driven by the dynamics I had mentioned. I think once we kind of hit pandemic, there was a little bit of a shift. There was a lot of uncertainty just everywhere, right? And a lot of uncertainty within these big companies about how they were going to invest, how they were going to run their business effectively with everybody staying home for at least a year or more. So there was a pullback, I would say, considerably. Now, the investment, I would say public and private monies in that time frame, I think, were much elevated, and probably other panelists will talk about that. But from an M&A perspective, Big Pharma was kind of doing smaller deals, bolt-on deals, tuck-ins, their pipeline. The level of M&A at a dollar level is about $100 billion, so maybe a third of what was being done in the years prior. And I think coming out of the pandemic, more investment is being driven by this loss of exclusivity. I think we've mapped it out. There's about $200 billion worth of revenue that will be lost between now and 2030, with things kind of falling off the market like Eliquis and Farxiga and Keytruda. And so a lot of companies are trying to backfill those pipelines for sure. We also have, metabolism is taking off. And so you look at companies with there's Novo and Lilly, and they have enormous cash positions, right? And so they're looking to spend that cash. And so we're starting to see a lot more activity, I would say, even in a little bit in 2025, a lot more this year, even in the first quarter.
Absolutely. Christian, I'm going to come to you next. So AbbVie Ventures sits a little bit upstream of this M&A activity, right? The Jack just described, and you mentioned how many dollars you typically deploy in a year, targeting seed, Series A. What does the pipeline building activity and portfolio management look like for you right now? And how do you see the landscape sort of trending as we head into mid-year, end of year? Kind of paint that picture for us.
Great question. So the way we operate, right? So we have an investor partner mandate, which of course is the ambition, right? We're minority investors, so most of the companies we work with ultimately, we're one of many voices, right? But I think we bring an N of one biopharma perspective, right, to the table. What a transactable data package or also an investable data package may look like, right? So we tend to get engaged very early on in shaping that journey of the companies, even pre-seed, before we write the first few checks. Actually, we've been engaged with a couple companies here in the local ecosystem. So in the end, I think for us, equity is a tool, right? Sometimes it's investment, sometimes it's an investment part of a BD deal, sometimes we go straight into a BD deal, sometimes we it's a day one license, it's an option deal, it's an M&A. There's really no prescribed deal structure. Ultimately, the common theme is that together we want to do something that neither of us can do alone, right? That ultimately drives it. Obviously, if it's the more advanced it is, the more, it ties into a strategic long-term plan that the enterprise has, right? In terms of some of the points you just mentioned, Jacques, right? In terms of either backfilling losses of exclusivity events or actually forward building into new therapeutic areas like we have done most recently in obesity, or as we're re-entering pain, we've done a deal with a Chinese company on a NAV 1.1 asset in pain. So, it really depends. I think fundamentally there's great science everywhere. I think science gets made actionable locally, right, where you have the right mix of ingredients, particularly in early stage as we talk about company creation, which is what we tend to do. So we're exclusively first-in-class focused on medicines that in their future market competitive state can be truly best-in-class. But our BD organization does plenty of best-in-class engagements, right, where they're hunting around the world really for the best deals that fit our particular pipeline.
All right. Tim, I'm going to come to you now. Very similar question that I just posed to Christian. From your seat at Canaan, again, looking at seed and Series A, what trends are you seeing currently? How are you thinking about portfolio management, and what do you see for sort of mid-year and the rest of the year?
Yeah, so I think I think it all goes back to loss of exclusivity and a demand for de-risked near-term commercial products driving M&A. So I think we went through a robust period in the middle of the last decade, and then the markets got very frothy and M&A was dampened, but markets peaked in February of 21 and were down, and valuations corrected substantially for 4 years. And we're just now emerging from that. And as valuations corrected again, and as loss of exclusivity came near term, I think the M&A engine started. I think the good news is the M&A values are certainly higher than they historically have been. So if I just think back of norms that we look at in venture, we used to talk about 500 million being sort of an average early stage clinical exit. Now they're routinely $1 billion plus, which is great. But I think in contrast, if you look back in the middle of last decade, there's a lot of interest in platforms. So you think of gene editing, cell and gene therapy. We did heterobifunctionals, induced proximity. A lot of platform interest, and I think that's gone away because of the need for products. So as an early stage investor, a couple of things. There's less interest in what you're doing preclinically. Like there's very little value, and that's hard for an early stage investor because you can forget getting markups as you go from A to B or whatever. Right? That's not going to be part of your game. But if you're going to invest in early stage, preclinical concepts, you have to have a view toward a use case where in phase 1 you can prove out and de-risk this in a substantial indication. Because otherwise it's just you're in it too long. Right? If you have to wait out for a randomized controlled phase 2 study, you'll be at this forever. Our funds' lives are 10 years. So it just doesn't work. I would say the other thing that changed, though, from the big pharma side, less interest in small products, right? So the era of large pharma being involved in a lot of smaller indications, rare indications, much less so than it was historically. And I would say now our view on the pharma threshold is you have to be north of $2 billion in revenues to even be on the radar, and you have to have some differential benefit, for people to pay those big exits.
I think there's a ton of important points in there that you just made for founders to think about in terms of de-risking, positioning, and how to think about that path forward in terms of pharma interest and what you're developing. So thank you. Mitra, coming to you now. So Osage lives in a sort of company formation segment of the universe. We had a really great conversation about that the other day. You mentioned you work with about 150 university partners. And when we spoke earlier, you flagged your view that the investor community has gone a little bit risk off, which we've talked a little bit about already this morning, on new company builds specifically. And you really think this is where there's a lot of need. So kind of help us square that with the M&A concept that Jacques described, that Christian and Tim kind of touched on. Do you think venture is pulling capital towards just access at the expense of sort of new foundational biology? And what does that mean for someone who's, say, in an academic lab right now in terms of thinking about how they position their idea for a company?
Yeah,
there's a lot in there.
Thanks. And I think the foundation for this question was really set by the previous answers. And, I think there's been a lot of interest in me too, me better, approaches and going after validated targets and pathways. And there's, a ceiling that's going to be hit with the benefit that you can achieve hitting already validated targets. And, although a lot of VC firms have shifted to the focus of later stage, more de-risked assets, there is going to be a reckoning where we do need to revisit novel because there is still unmet need. And right now is the time, in my mind, to be focusing opportunistically on novel and preparing those opportunities for when folks do revisit, what's next. Does that mean it's easy? No, right? I think there's very little capital right now that is risk on in the sense of wanting to fund novel. And, I think of the few of us that are, looking at that right now have to be very selective in the types of risks we're taking when we're doing this. So if you're a founder, I think a lot of it is, staying close to folks that are, that are experienced and have developed drugs in the past. And, I think pulling resources in the ecosystem so that you can put together a package with input from pharma, with input from other investors that is investable, when you're able to engage with them. And I think, what was the second part of the question?
No, I think how do you, if I'm in an academic lab right now, like how am I thinking about this and approaching this challenge of kind of a risk-off environment with the long-term view of we kind of need some risk in the universe. So it's kind of like we're waiting for the market to catch up.
You're being creative about how you're getting funding.
Yeah.
Right? You're looking, I know that there's a little bit less of the federal funding that's coming in right now, and there's pressure being put on that source. But it's being entrepreneurial, it's going to foundations, it's going to high net worth individuals, it's really figuring out creative ways to get that funding to de-risk your approach, your technology, your platform. And again, getting the input so that you're doing the right experiments and not putting a package together that's not exciting when an investor or a potential pharma partner comes to you.
All right, thank you. I'm going to pivot a little bit to something a lot more tactical, and I love the next topic that we're going to talk about for audiences like this. We're going to come to the founders in the room right now. So I want each of you to give me two things. The single biggest unforced error you see founders make in a pitch, and then the single thing that elevates a pitch discussion from that's interesting to we have to do this, sign the term sheet right now. And if you can give a concrete example, anonymous, of course, to kind of illustrate, that'd be, I think, really interesting. So, Tim, I'm going to start with you. You've been on kind of both sides of this universe, Accuragen and now as a GP. How do you think through a pitch? What works great? What does not?
Yeah, so I mean, by the time you sort of get to the pitch, it should be already decided, I would say. So, and my point there is like, in early stage venture, almost nothing happens cold and nothing happens. I've never met a single thing where I said, I have to do this day. It's not the nature of them. These are all very early stage concepts. So the first thing I would say, like, nothing happens cold. You have to build relationships. If you don't have relationships, as I always said, you have to buddy with someone who does. Because, again, I would say, I don't know how many investments I've done in my life, but I would say less than 10% of them were cold, meaning like I had no connection to some person involved at the start. And people say, well, that's biased. That's, how could you do that? The personal parts of this are so important, and the trust, because it's going to be hard and things are going to go sideways. To me, the interpersonal part of this is as big or a bigger risk than the technical parts of what we do. So building those relationships, and I think, institutions like Yale do a lot to foster this, and the group here at Yale Innovations does a lot to try to bring together those relationships between academic founders and investors and pharma people, because the relationships are critical. So that'd be point number one. Point number two would get back to really getting help and understanding where the market's going. It's not where it is now. You're doing all early stage stuff. Your stuff's going to be a product 15 years from now, right? So you really have to get an understanding of, just as some of the things I was talking about earlier, like, if you're starting something early, like how does this become investable? And it can't be investable if value's not until phase 3. Like, you're never going to get there. So again, you have to work with people who can be creative about what you can do with your technology to really try to be able to do something valuable early and as early as possible. I would say in this day, preclinical is impossible. Back a decade ago, you could create a lot of value preclinically. So today, you have to be able to project forward and say, what can I do clinically with my technology in early clinical development that's going to attract interest? And that means it's going to be very de-risking for some valuable indication where your product offers some benefit to not just what's in the market, but what else is in development today.
So have good foresight and planning, thoughtful planning. All right. Mitra, coming to you next. You work with a lot of academic founders, right? From that side specifically, what's the most common piece of professional growth that needs to happen along the company formation journey?
I think Yale Innovations does a really great job of supporting this, but making sure in your pitch you have a very clear sense of where you fit in the standard of care and where you will fit in the armamentarium of options that an indication or a therapeutic area, that you're working in, where you're where you're going to fit. I think a lot of times when we hear pitches, there is a target, a compound that's being developed, or a compound against a target that's being developed with no real sense of, how it's going to be transformational for an indication. Just that we know that, we think it looks good in a mouse model, but to Tim's point, the foresight of how you're going to be developing this and what it's going to look like in the competitive landscape and anticipate 5 years forward, if you're still going to be, something that is relevant. I think that's the first thing is really just understanding what the unmet need is and what you're solving for with your solution or with your approach. The second is I always get a kick out of the slides that are built where it says, you'll have this, 10 billion outcome in 2 years. I mean, that's just sort of a naive slide to put on, in any deck. So don't try to tell an investor that you're going to have an exit in, 1.5 years and they're going to make billions of dollars. That's not really what we are looking for you to comment on at that point. We do want to understand prevalence and market size, but drug development's hard. Things always take longer than you think it is. But we want to see that you have a clear sense of how much money it's going to take to get you where you're going to get. But other than that, we don't need, commentary on the math that we're doing in the background for returns analysis.
I should say the $10 billion a year thing also doesn't work great in an IPO roadshow a lot of the time. So that theme stays with you. So the thoughtfulness about what the competitive landscape and timelines look like doesn't go away, no matter what stage you're at. Thank you, Mitra. Christian, how should a founder think about pitching a strategic investor in the earliest stages, and what differentiators can you offer as a strategic that might not be available elsewhere?
Yeah, no, thank you. Very much echo, I think, what's been said so far. I think in the end, maybe knowing where you fit is even more important for a strategic investor, right? And I think this goes both ways, both on the upside and the downside. In other words, do your homework, I think, is the biggest piece of advice, right? Do your research, talk to people, anticipate where the standard of care is going, where your unique value proposition that's differentiated may fit ultimately. And then for a strategic investor, when you pitch us, or our peers for that matter, right, know where are you fitting within the emerging pipeline. Now, sometimes this is hard to know, right, particularly on the preclinical side, because we're not publicizing everything that's on there, but through conversations and early engagements, that is typically something that can be found out. And we love to engage very, very early. Just to give you a sense of scale, right, much like our peers, we look at 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 opportunities a year, right? So that's, somewhere around 8 to 12 a day, right, across therapeutic areas. So it's a volume game on the one hand, right? So to Tim's point, I think I don't think we've ever invested in a cold introduction, right? Usually it's come through some trusted source to us. Oftentimes it comes years before. You asked for an example. Actually, we've been working with a company here in which we're currently syndicating, which we've started engaging with almost 3 years ago. Actually, it was part of this summit as a conversation, right? And I think we've worked with the company, and I'd like to think help make that value proposition investable, right? So I think knowing where you fit in the market is ultimately the single most respectful thing I think you can do to not waste your time and not waste the investor's time, given just the sheer volume of things that we look at.
That's a great takeaway too. So the conversations you have today may pay off a few years from now, but building the relationship over time is really, really important. Thanks for flagging that. That's awesome. Jacques, I'm coming to you next. So I think what's interesting is that founders in the room are probably going to encounter pharma BD folks like yourself, potentially long before they're an actual candidate to do anything with, right? So your partnering talks, your own search and evaluation that might be talking to you sort of in an advisory capacity. So what are the things a founder does in those interactions that can hurt them later that they don't even realize they're doing? And then flip that around. What do they do really well that they might not realize they're doing? No, they'll realize it after you tell them right now.
A couple things. I mean, I love what Tim said about building relationships, and I've met a number of people over the last day or so, and oftentimes I'm meeting them cold at summits and conferences like this, and it's a great place to start. And we don't have to have a long conversation, right? We can have a very short conversation. I met a couple people yesterday. I'd like to follow up with them on their technologies, but I don't want to have that conversation, at the reception or whatnot. But I kind of introduce myself, have them introduce themselves, and then we plan to have a chat later next week, right? And that will be a quick kind of 30-minute call, and then that's where it starts, really. My organization is huge. So in this process, you're going to meet our R&D folks, you're going to meet our transaction folks, you're going to probably meet 5 other BD folks. And we're all going to get a sense of what that relationship looks like over time, and this will kind of evolve, and we'll get a sense of how consistent your organization or your group or your small company might be over that period of time. I think what hurts people sometimes is jumping in too quick. They want to tell me everything about their technology within that 5-minute conversation we're having at the reception, and that's just probably the wrong way to do it, or at least not my approach, and it sounds like others as well. I would say another piece is really not knowing their patient target or epidemiology that well, and it kind of gets back to knowing where you fit within the landscape. I would say kind of having a better idea of how your asset or how your program might be differentiated, what kind of niche population you might be kind of targeting is very helpful to kind of understand how your program differentiates. And then I would layer on that a little bit more, a lot of people have very early preclinical data. Really, from a pharma perspective, we want to know how clinically meaningful that data is. We don't want to just see an improvement. We want to try to understand, once this eventually gets to humans, how much of that change is relevant clinically. So I think the things that work well is developing that relationship, understand that there's a process in it, being consistent over time in those interactions. I think having a reasonable sense of the amount of investment it takes to bring your program from maybe preclinical stage or IND stage up through phase 3 and an eventual approval is really important.
I think one theme that's interesting to point out, so it's the consistency, the follow-up, the touch points, the relationship building, goes back to what Tim really explicitly flagged earlier in the conversation too, about its personal relationships as much as a lot of the other bits and pieces that we're talking about. So that's excellent. Okay, we're going to dramatically shift topics again. So there was one topic on our preparatory calls for this that really I kind of just let everyone talk and take a lot of notes and absorb as much as I could. And I think we could have kept going if I didn't cut us off at our 30-minute Zoom call. So I want to talk a little bit about one thing that's been sort of consuming a lot of oxygen in conversations like this, especially over the last couple of years, and that's the US-China dynamic and how founders, in particular, folks developing tech, need to kind of think about the world that we're currently living in. So, Tim, I'm going to come to you first. So you mentioned in the prep call that you don't make momentum plays, and that China has become, in your sort of opinion, a bit of like a herd mentality topic. So walk us through what that looks like from an investor discipline standpoint, and then what it means for a founder or an academic lab today thinking about IP and timing. And I'm going to ask a lot of you something very similar, but go ahead.
Yeah, so I'll just start, I understand the movement to access assets from China from an investor perspective, right? It's a financial arbitrage. If you can get the same thing there for a third or 25% that you can get from a Western company, it makes total sense. I think right now it's really fueled again back by some of our earlier comments. Tremendous eagerness for clinical stage assets with data, and most of them are next-in-class assets, so meaning the target's already been proven out, often in the West, and then people go shopping for the next one in China at a discount and then bring it over here and develop it. So I understand that. I'm an investor, so I understand that. It's not what I do. Like, you know, I'm not like a financial arbitrage guy. It's not what I was born to do. But for certain investors, I think it makes sense. Pharma's taking advantage of it for the same reasons. But I think right now, you know, this is an innovation summit. I would say that's not about innovation. Maybe that's financial innovation of how to, you know, get a lower cost basis for your assets, but that's not about scientific and medical innovation. Again, almost all of the stuff is, I just call it next in class. People say it's best in class, who knows? But yeah, I would just argue, does the world really need, you know, 10 PD-1 VEGFs or, you know, 10 T-slips, you know, but there seems to be a huge appetite for them. I'm not going to win that game because they're largely late-stage clinical development plays, and between the upfront and the amount to fund a large phase 2 program or a phase 3 program, that's not what early-stage venture does. So it doesn't fit with what we do, so we watch it and we get tempted, but it's not core to what we're going to do. And again, I would say in terms of like, if you're going to play in early development stage opportunities, which is largely where we play, you know, you can't do that across continents. That happens in small rooms with people sharing ideas, generating data, looking at data, saying what to do next. You know, that just can't happen that way. And I can't underscore, like, in this world where it's become less important, how important physical contact is to early discovery stage companies. You know, and nothing happens in meetings, nothing happens in Zooms. That's the, you know, perfunctory stuff that goes on. The best stuff happens spontaneously. When you go for a run in the morning, you meet your colleague at 8:30 when you walk in the door and you say, what do you think about this idea? And 2 hours later, you're acting on it and seeing how it goes. So to me, that's what, like, early stage, you know, we do company creation. I've had the opportunity to, you know, start companies with people around here at Yale and stuff. That's what actually happens there. And I, you know, that is what we do. And, you know, I can't do that 6,000 miles away. It just, you know, it's not, I don't see that happening.
All right, Mitra, I'm going to come to you next. You're shaking your head a lot, so you can follow up on that. You flagged something in our call the other day that I think is interesting, and I want to dig in a little bit, and it's sort of the assumption about when you're looking at a published paper, what that reflects. Is it the latest and greatest, or is it something that's been established and maybe simmering for a little bit? And I want to get at sort of the disclosure of information piece here. So if I'm a founder, I want you to unpack that a little bit. How should founders think about timing of disclosure of information, filing IP, you know, what to say publicly and when to do it?
Yeah, and this will be in concert with your tech transfer office, but there's also incentives for a PI to be out there and publishing and presenting the latest and greatest work from their lab. But there's been a pullback from that sort of style as of late, and a lot of that comes from the pressure from China and the idea that, you know, you can source really interesting science and biological insights that have been accomplished in the U.S. or in the Western world, and quickly, you know, execute on it, you know, and iterate and optimize on it in China, so you can basically leapfrog anybody working on a target, a pathway, a drug here, in doing so. So I think, you know, the more sophisticated entrepreneurial PIs have caught on to this and have been much more careful about when they share their, you know, the work that they've generated in their lab, the insights they've generated in their labs, and that means holding off on that Nature paper. It means not putting all the details in that ASCO poster, or not even submitting that ASCO poster anymore. And so when we are seeing things published, it's likely something that has been done in a lab 5 or so years ago at that point, and not something that is, you know, bleeding edge anymore, you know, for that PI, because they wanted to make sure that they had time to get somewhere near clinic before they're filing IP and before they're disclosing more broadly. I mean, the other level of that is how you do, how that operates at, with the tech transfer office. With your tech transfer office, you should be disclosing things, but there should, and what you're disclosing is firewalled off to the rest of the world, right? So that's a safe place to be disclosing those ideas. But broader than that, that's when folks have to be much more careful about, the work that they've been doing, especially if they want to be the ones that are at the leading edge of developing that idea.
All right. So for those of you receiving postdoc applications, and the resume says manuscript in prep, understand that piece. That's very important. Christian. So AbbVie kind of sits on both sides of this, right? So you're a global investor. AbbVie's also a global buyer. So when you are looking at a founder that's pitching you, how is this China dynamic showing up in your diligence and how you're sort of building terms of your deal? And how should a founder in this room think about it practically?
Thanks, Eric. Great question. And yeah, as you said, I think that the somewhat nuanced perspective for us is right. We're both on the buy side and the investing side. I think the scale of the ecosystem, the time advantage, the cost advantage is real, right? We can't argue with that. They're 3 times as fast at a third of the cost, particularly in large biologic molecules and genetic medicines. Anything that can be engineered will be engineered, which I think ties into what you just said, Mitra, right? Which is be very careful when you publish, and even what you say in abstracts, right? Because once it's out there, the AI scrapers will get it, and then within a week, the molecules are in the pipeline to be made, right? I mean, we've seen this. We've tested this, actually, specifically just to get a sense of how the ecosystem is working. And we're not just talking about one being made, right? We're talking about a dozen or 2 being made, because currently it's a race to the bottom in many cases, particularly in the validated, quote-unquote, high-value targets, such as bispecifics in oncology, immunology. Neuroscience less so. But it's very interesting. So Tim, you mentioned this. I think it's a best-in-class innovation ecosystem right now, right? Geared towards generating sellable molecules, so molecules that compete ultimately on a global market. So in that sense, China has become a shopping mall or shopping catalog, right? For us, for PE funds, for venture funds. And all the companies are there and have built on-the-ground teams. Actually, I almost walked in one of our competitors' buses out of the hotel because it looked exactly the same as our bus. So I think that's where we currently are, and I think we're at the beginning of a phase where Western companies, Western venture funds are beginning to try to access the capabilities, right, to develop their own molecules in China, right? A lot of pharma companies are now thinking about, should we ship our own assets to China, right, just to generate some early clinical signals? Because that's in the end, right, where for a pharma company, the portfolio prioritization happens, right? It's generation of human signal, either on the safety side or on the early efficacy side, right? Before you spend a lot of capital on phase 2, phase 3 developments. And I think this is where currently the Chinese ecosystem has a real advantage, right? Through the IIT ecosystem and just the sheer scale again, right? I mean, we were in a hospital in one of their big centers recently where they see, 5,000 dermatology patients a day, right? I mean, we have problem finding certain centers where they find it a year here, right? So again, for best-in-class molecule, that's all well and good. But I think the upside is, if you look at the traditional sort of innovation ecosystem indicators that precede a real boom of investing in biotech building and company building, since you did ask about the founder perspective, while China outcompetes or certainly equates the US and certain Western countries, I think if you look at top 10 scientific journal publications, STEM graduates, patent filings, clinical trials, study starts, incubator, co-laboratory working space, square footage, et cetera, that has not yet translated into a wave of true first-in-class innovation, right? So novel targets, novel biology. And that is simply due to the fact that the Chinese market currently does not have a early-stage venture capital ecosystem like we have here, right? There's only 2 ways to generate returns on the same timelines, typically 10 years, that we have, right? It's M&A or going public. And the companies that are going public are the clinical stage companies, right, that are being set up to be sold or have partnership deals. Now, To me, that is a question of when that wave's gonna crest and ultimately crash, not if. I think it will happen. And I think it will happen for the simple reason that many of the deals that are being done today, if you look at them, they're sort of early, mid clinical stage, right, with large royalties, large milestone payments, et cetera. Some of them are going to be successful drugs on the U.S. market, right? And for some of them, billions will be flushed into the pockets of investors and entrepreneurs on the Chinese ecosystem. I think at that point, which is probably in the next 5 to 10 years, the same will happen which happened in Europe and the US 20, 30, 40 years ago, right? Where some people, instead of sitting on the beach and enjoying their early retirement, will go back to the bench and, deploy some of that risk capital into people and science and technologies they believe in, right? So I think we have a little bit of time, I think, to figure out how we compete. And currently, what we tell founders is first-in-class science, right, with really new ideas, right, that are investable, will remain competitive, I think, at least for the next decade or so on the market.
All right. So what I'm hearing is find the guy on the beach for the risk capital for the founders out there. And also that time when you almost walked onto Jacques' AstraZeneca bus when you were in China. So I'm going to go to you next, Jacques.
Was the Lilly bus, actually. But
oh, okay. All right. My bad. I think your perspective is going to be really interesting on this, right, given your seat doing BD. How has this dynamic changed your own workflow, the piece about China? Obviously, without getting into specific deals, what has changed about how you and your peers are sourcing and evaluating assets in 2026, say, versus 4 or 5 years ago?
Yeah, it's Christian, you touched on a number of things that I think were really important there. I think just to kind of add on to that, the level of China investment from a pharma perspective was about 2% of all of pharma deal making probably in 2022. As of 2024, 2025, it's about 30%. It's growing. AZ has done a number of deals in China, has done a number of large deals in China. I will say we have kind of a company mandate to always be looking there. We have a relatively new, they've been there for probably 5 to 6 years, I believe, but a relatively new venture arm in China. So we have boots on the ground there that can actually go visit the companies and interact with the scientists, and that is tremendously helpful for us. It's also a way for some pharma companies to catch up, I will say. So, for instance, right, if you're injectable GLP-1s, there will be kind of and Lilly just had their oral GLP-1 that was approved. AstraZeneca wasn't involved in the space, didn't have an oral. How could we do this quickly? How could we validate that an oral GLP-1 was going to do well in humans? We turned to China. That's where we were able to acquire our oral GLP-1. It's now finishing phase 2. But we were able to de-risk that, not just because we kind of knew the target, but Christian, you mentioned the IIT studies, right? They have a mechanism where you can get human data relatively soon and relatively quickly. And so that's enormously advantageous for some pharma shoppers to go in and kind of de-risk, is it safe in humans? Are we seeing a level of efficacy that we can kind of bank on? So I would say that's kind of the scope of how things have been from 2022 to the 2024 timeframe. I think that you're now seeing kind of larger deals. AstraZeneca did a deal earlier this year with CSPC. I believe Bristol just did a very large deal with Hengrui to the same order of magnitude. And these are multi-target deals. Some of them are de-risked kind of targets. Some of them are targets to be named later. There's a lot of biobucks tied into those deal numbers, right? But again, to Christian's point, I think you're seeing a huge amount of investment, kind of influx in China. Where we see the innovation really isn't so much in your 0 to 1 type innovators with brand new targets, modalities. Back to Tim's point, you're seeing kind of fast followers or me betters. You put a lot of people around a particular target. They're going to try to find the best chemistry, the best safety and efficacy profile. They're great at doing that, and that is the value right now in their innovation. But that will shift to being able to take more risk in China is away from the optimization and towards the more newer, more innovative type technologies with the influx of these big pharma deals and the investments that we're seeing there. So.
All right. I do want to make sure we reserve some time for Q&A. I think that's really important. But there's one topic I want to touch on. So a really quick lightning round. Everyone gets 30 seconds. So think about this before I toss it to you. One thing we haven't talked about that entire symposia are dedicated to is AI. We haven't really dug in on that today. So I want to touch on it because I'm sure a lot of folks in the room are leveraging AI or ML in some capacity for their development programs. So, Christian, how do you think about AI and its positioning, and how do you understand it?
I think for us it's a tool. Of course, we deploy it across the entire enterprise, both internal builds as well as through collaboration. So we use it from drug discovery all the way to development, enrollment, manufacturing, getting medicines to patients, collecting feedback from patients, etc. In the end, I think it's a tool, right? It's not a magic solution. So when we think about it from an investment perspective, we need a use case. And generally, we give these AI companies an actual test case, right? So ideally, a positive control we know the outcome from. So if they can reproduce it, great. We have another conversation. If not, then probably not.
Great. Jacques?
Currently, AstraZeneca has a big mandate to invest in AI. The current projects are mostly focused in operations, I would say. That will change to more of a clinical dynamic for patient selection and trial design. From a company perspective, we have yet to see a AI-designed drug successfully move all the way through the clinic and be approved. I think a lot of AI or tech-type bio companies will eventually get there. We'll have to kind of see which AI approach is best, and there's several out there. From a BD perspective, and speaking from kind of our tech and platform group, which is part of our group, we've taken a real interest in some of the tissue banks and biobanks, where they have actual tissues and they can use AI and machine learning to kind of understand those tissues and disease tissues better. So we've looked at a number of those, but I think it's relatively too early for us to make good bets in that area. So.
Yeah, I'm a therapeutics investor, and I'm not qualified to evaluate your AI ML black box platform. I am, however, able to look at the compound that it spits out, and I've yet to see a company spit out a compound that I personally wanted to invest in. So still waiting.
Tim?
Yeah, I mean, I think AI needs data sets, and novel biology, by definition, doesn't have them. So, I mean, I think that's the first issue. You can go to nearest neighbors and things like that, but so much biology is context dependent, time dependent, cell dependent, hormonal status dependent. There's so many variables that I think it's a long way there. But all of our companies use it to some extent. None of them are AI companies, but we use tools to try to see if we can, help develop a small molecule faster or better for antibodies. Again, I think they're also helpful. So I think, they're tools, it's incremental. It didn't just start, for those of us who are old enough, it didn't just start now. We've been using these sorts of tools for a long time, and to me, it's just a continuation of that. But I think, a long way to go from pushing a button and having a drug.
Yep. All right. Thank you all very, very much. We have a few minutes left, and I definitely want to make sure we can use the time to take some audience questions. Hand went up. See you.
Hi. Thank you very much. I was wondering if you guys could comment on some of the characteristics you look for in scientists that will make the next great founder, the next great innovator versus those who won't.
Who wants to take it?
Yeah, maybe I'll start and throw something out there. And I think it's the ability to differentiate applied science from basic science, right? Science for the sake of curiosity is great. We all love that. That's why we got into this game, right? But I think in the end, if you want to found something, you need to sell it to somebody, right? Either along the way or at the end, right? So it needs to fit into that future state again somewhere, right? So I think it's a differentiator between what's a nice to have versus what's a must have.
Tim, can you reiterate the personal touch piece that you mentioned? What creates how can you find a great scientist that's going to be a great founder? The interpersonal piece, just probably worth repeating.
Me?
Yeah. You said it first, so maybe you can say it again.
I said it again.
At the beginning of the hour.
Just now?
Yeah.
I'm not sure what I said, but again, I think for people younger in their career, in their academic careers, I think trying to learn from other academics who have navigated this successfully and who understand it is probably the first place I would go. And again, I think those building those relationships there could again bring you in. To the investor community or to the pharma community. And I think that's where you learn like what people are looking for and what helps differentiate that. It is about basic versus applied science for sure. But again, it's sort of having the foresight to do something different enough and potentially important enough that it captures interest early.
All right. We'll jump to the next question. Well, there's so many. You raised your hand very fast, so go ahead.
Yes. Hi, Taylor Moritz here with Panluminate. Question, for companies creating a new category rather than disrupting an existing one and already generating revenue, how do you think about benchmarking revenue projections when there's no direct comparable? And does early traction change how you underwrite the risk?
That's a great question.
I'm never near revenues.
I was going to say.
I haven't been near a revenue in like 25 years. So.
Yeah. Yeah.
Happy to take that one because I've spent a lot of time doing it. So kind of for uncharted territory, right? You're never going to get away from how that revenue is built up with respect to thinking about the patient population, the epidemiology, and all the cuts that you do to determine what the right patient level is, what the adherence of those patients taking the therapy could be, and then what you think. If there are no competitors, right, then you will own the market share, so you'll get 100% of the market share. That's kind of a line item in there. There's also a pricing dynamic, and I am not a pricing guy. That seems like a whole mystery a little bit to me if there's no precedent. But something that's reasonable in the market will be priced in for that, and so that's how you get your top line there. But from looking at the development standpoint, right, the risk always remains. I mean, big pharma generally has their kind of standard probability of technical and regulatory success benchmarks. Depending on which therapeutic area or disease area, those get toggled up or toggled down. More data is always great, and you kind of step through and you build value over time through the preclinical and then the early phase 1-2 stages to kind of unlock that value over time. And I don't think that changes all that much.
And I will say this is a challenge for companies that want to go to the public markets as well. They're doing something truly novel because when you are thinking about that IPO, the first question from your analysts, from the public buy side is going to be like, who are the comps? How am I thinking about the pricing dynamics? And to your point, that community that does the pricing at that point in time are your bankers. That's why you hire them. So you really want to find the right banker that understands the market that you're going into very, very well. And that may be who in what institution knows this universe best. What I see a lot of times is, well, I need to go with X, Y, or Z bulge bracket. And you say, why? Why that one? Well, I know somebody there. It's like, well, is the best person for your market in that one versus another? And that's sort of a balancing act that companies that are doing an IPO and shortly thereafter are still thinking through. You want to baked in by the time the IPO comes, so your pricing is right. But you're not alone in that challenge for sure.
Yeah, maybe I'll add just two things, right? One is I think most forecasts are wrong. Some are useful, right? So I think the assumptions going into them, matter a lot. And then secondarily, I think, we tend to think in fan of outcome scenarios, right? Not in point benchmarks. Right. So again, that 10 billion number is relatively useless to us, right? We want to know under what scenarios can we get to 10 billion.